They say silence is golden, but no one tells you how sharp it can get when it's forced into your throat like a blade. It was a Wednesday morning, not much different from any other. The sun had only just begun to peek through the clouds, painting the kitchen wall in those soft gold streaks I always loved. I was seated at the dining table with my Bible open and my cup of chamomile cooling beside me. My lips moved softly, just above a whisper, as they had every morning for the last 40 years. Psalm 121, I murmured, hands resting lightly on the worn leather edges of my Bible. I lift up my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? I barely got through the verse before I heard it. The sound of stocking feet padding across hardwood. Angela. Her voice was sharp enough to slice through scripture. You're too loud when you pray, Grace. She said it like someone commenting on the weather. Not unkind, but sterile, detached, like I was background noise in her minimalist lifestyle. I looked up, startled. She stood in the doorway to the hallway, arms folded, still in her beige bathrobe. The baby monitor blinked in her hand, silent. I wanted to tell her that this was the only time of day that still belonged to me, that I wasn't being loud, I was being present. But instead, I just closed my Bible slowly and folded my hands over it. My wedding band, a little loose these days, clinked gently against the table. I didn't mean to disturb anyone, I said, voice quiet, almost embarrassed. Angela shrugged. It's just, the baby is a light sleeper and we're trying to establish routine. Routine, that word again. The same one she'd used last week when she moved my cross from the mantel to the hallway closet. Said it didn't match the new aesthetic. Said it was too visually busy. I watched as she turned and left the room, not even waiting for a reply. Just like that, the morning air turned stale. I sat for a long while staring at the wall, Psalm 121, lingering in my throat like an unfinished melody. My son Mark wasn't home. He worked long hours now, commuting into the city, coming home after dark. When he did walk through the door, he'd greet the baby, kiss Angela's cheek, and offer me a tired smile, the kind you give to someone in a waiting room, civil, brief, impersonal. He didn't used to be like that. He used to wake me up on Saturday mornings just to show me the fort he'd built in the living room, dragging couch cushions and kitchen chairs together like he was building a kingdom. When he was 10, he asked me to pray over his hamster when it got sick. He held my hand with the same faith I thought he'd carry for life. Now he leaves the room when I sing hymns under my breath while folding laundry. Later that day, I took out the baby's onesies to fold, and I noticed the corner of my prayer shawl crumpled beneath the laundry basket. I reached for it gently, fingertips grazing the fine embroidery my sister had stitched by hand before she passed. It smelled faintly of lavender and old cedarwood, a scent that reminded me of simpler mornings and open windows. When I brought it back to my room, technically the guest room, it felt even smaller than it had the day before. The twin bed was still pressed into the corner, a leftover from when Mark's college roommate stayed with them one summer. There were no family photos on the walls, just a floating shelf with a plastic diffuser, 3 beige paperbacks with their spines uncracked, and a print of a field with no trees. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wooden cross I had leaned against the lampstand. For a second, I considered hiding it again. I didn't want to be accused of clutter, of noise, of taking up space. Instead, I took a breath and set the shawl beside it. Not a statement, not a rebellion, just a quiet reminder to myself, if no one else, that I was still here. Dinner was a quiet affair. Mark had called saying he'd be late. Angela reheated pasta and offered me a plate without making eye contact. I prayed silently over the food, eyes closed, no lips moving, no words spoken, just breath and memory. Angela sat across from me, scrolling her phone, her face lit by the soft blue glow of the screen. The baby monitor blinked again on the counter. The silence felt heavier than any psalm I'd ever recited. I couldn't help thinking of all the mornings I had filled this house with music and scripture. When Mark was little, he'd hum along with my hymns. He even asked me once if God heard him too. I don't know if he still believed. That night, as I sat in bed, brushing out the day's knots from my graying hair, I thought about the sound of my voice in an empty church. I hadn't heard it in years, not since the old chapel on Lexington closed down, the one where my husband proposed to me after a Tuesday evening prayer meeting. It had been sold to developers and turned into a yoga studio now. But I remembered the way light spilled across the stained glass during morning mass. I remembered the wooden pews that creaked just enough to remind you of their history. I remembered the warmth of candles lit in reverence, not for aesthetics. I missed it, all of it. Maybe that was the problem. I missed something no one else remembered. But a thought flickered in the back of my mind, faint but persistent. If there wasn't a place for my voice here, maybe I needed to build one. I didn't sleep that night, not because of the baby crying or Angela pacing the hallway. It was quiet enough in the house. Too quiet, in fact. The kind that wraps around your thoughts until they stop being thoughts and start becoming decisions. At some point, around 3 in the morning, I found myself sitting back at the kitchen table in my light blue dress, barefoot, a blanket around my shoulders. I hadn't even turned on the light. The moon was doing all the work through the window above the sink, casting faint shadows on the linoleum. I stared at my Bible, closed this time, and thought about how strange it was to feel exiled in a house I helped make possible, not through money, but through presence, through years of babysitting, of casseroles, of prayers whispered in the hospital waiting room when Mark was sick at 5 and again at 16. I thought presence meant something. But these walls didn't remember what they owed. In the morning, I didn't say much. I made coffee before Angela could come in and rearrange the kitchen again. She was polite, almost overly so, asking if I'd had a good sleep. I told her I hadn't. She nodded and said she understood, but I don't think she did. After she left to take the baby to her mother's yoga group, I stayed behind and walked out into the backyard. The grass had grown up around the stepping stones. The rose bush I'd planted 2 springs ago was still holding on, barely. The little garden bed had turned into a half-hearted rectangle of withered parsley and dry lavender. I pulled one weed, then another, then stopped. I wasn't tending to anything. I was just stalling. I took the bus that afternoon. First time in months. Mark used to drive me when I had errands, but I stopped asking. Independence wasn't just about movement anymore, it was about space to think. The driver didn't ask questions. The bus was nearly empty, save for a teenager with headphones and a woman reading a paperback romance in a seat near the front. I chose the window seat, 2 rows from the back, and watched the world pass in that slow, reflective way only public transit allows. We passed the old Lexington turnoff, and without really deciding, I pulled the bell. The stop was half a block from the chapel, or what used to be the chapel, St. Annabel's Church, closed 7 years ago. I knew because I was there on its final Sunday. The building was still there, wedged between a shuttered dry cleaner and a fenced-off lot. The white paint had begun peeling from the trim, and the front steps sagged a little from the middle, like tired knees, but the bell tower still stood tall. The cross atop it was chipped but intact. I walked around it slowly. The windows were still stained glass, though 2 of them had been boarded up with plywood. The front door was chained. I didn't try to touch it. It wasn't the building I needed to enter. It was the memory of it. I sat on the low stone wall that bordered the chapel yard and let the silence settle over me. This place had once held voices, baptisms, weddings, small children running up the aisle while ushers tried not to laugh, and prayer, real prayer, not whispered out of fear, but lifted like music. I remembered when my husband stood in that very doorway, smiling at me after evening service. He didn't even kneel when he asked me to marry him, just looked at me like he already knew the answer. I said yes before he finished the sentence. That chapel had held more of me than any house ever did. And now it stood abandoned, like a faith too loud for its neighbors. I asked around that afternoon. I found a hardware store clerk named Jorge, who said the building was city-owned now, caught in probate after the diocese let it go. He gave me a name, someone on the county land office board who might know more. I jotted it all down in my journal. By the time I got home, it was dark. Mark was sitting at the table, with takeout on the counter. Angela had put the baby down. No one asked where I'd been. I think they assumed I was off at the library, or walking in the park, like I sometimes did when the house got too tight. I ate quietly, declined a second helping, and went to bed early. The next morning, I called the number Jorge gave me. It went to voicemail. I left a message, then another the next day. By the 3rd call, I got a response. The man's voice was polite, Midwestern twang, buried under decades of bureaucracy. He said the chapel was technically available, needed repairs, needed zoning paperwork, needed a lot, but it wasn't impossible. And that was all I needed to hear. I spent the next 2 weeks filling out forms. I contacted the zoning department, called a contractor from church, asked around about electricians and plumbers who might work for less if the job had a purpose beyond money. I didn't tell Mark or Angela. Not because I wanted it to be a secret, but because I needed it to belong to me before it became another thing they rolled their eyes at. I used my late husband's pension. We never spent much, never needed to. The money had sat untouched for years. This felt like the right reason to finally move it. Angela said I was spending a lot of time out lately. I told her I was catching up with old friends. She smiled and said she was glad I had outlets. On a Thursday, I stood in front of the chapel again, this time with a man named Emmett who had worked construction for 40 years. He whistled low when he saw the inside, said it'd be a challenge, said it might take months. I nodded and told him I wasn't in a hurry. I just wanted a place where voices could be lifted again, without apology. The first hammer fell on a Monday morning. Emmett brought his nephew Troy, a quiet young man with careful hands and a habit of whistling while he worked. They started with the door, unhinging the warped panels, hauling them aside like reverent mourners, lifting something sacred from its place of decay. I stood off to the side, a thermos of coffee in my hand, watching every movement like it was part of a liturgy. The air smelled like old wood and dust, like memory unsealed. Inside, the chapel was worse than I remembered. Water damage crept down 2 walls like veins. The altar had collapsed into itself, and the floor bowed in places where time had pulled it downward. But the bones were strong. Emmett said that more than once. "She's tired, not broken." I liked that. We worked in quiet rhythm those early days. I wasn't much used to them physically, but I brought sandwiches and kept records. I had a little notebook for expenses, a folder for permits. Every check I wrote felt like a prayer answered backward in time, like my husband had known I'd need this someday. Troy brought in an old radio on the 3rd day, and I asked if we could tune it to a gospel station. He nodded without comment. A few hours later, I heard him humming along to Blessed Assurance. I smiled without letting him see. By the end of the first week, we'd cleared the debris. The broken pews had been hauled to the back lot. The altar remains were neatly stacked under a tarp. The windows, those not boarded, were cleaned carefully. Some of the glass had survived, those deep reds and blues catching the light just so in the afternoon. Emmett found me one day staring at the Mary window, the only one fully intact. "You want to keep her in place?" I nodded. "She's still watching." I hadn't told Angela or Mark where I was going every day. Mark didn't ask. He seemed relieved to have fewer moments where we might cross paths in the hallway. Angela mentioned once that the house felt calmer lately. I told her I was volunteering downtown. She said that sounded nice and didn't press. There was something freeing in the omission. Not deception exactly, just keeping something for myself for once. On the second Sunday of renovations, I brought in a folding chair and sat in the center of the cleared chapel floor. The sun had found its way through one of the restored windows, casting warm color across the dusty boards. I opened my Bible and read aloud for the first time in weeks. Not in a whisper, not in a mutter. "Let everything that has breath praise the Lord." My voice cracked in the middle of the line, but I kept reading, and when I looked up, Troy was standing at the door, not saying a word, just listening. A few days later, a woman stopped by, said her name was Clara. She lived 2 blocks over and had heard something was stirring at the old chapel. "You the one fixing it?" "I suppose I am," I said. She smiled, weathered and wide. "Let me know if you need hands. I got plenty of time and not much else." That afternoon, she came back with work gloves and a small army of retired neighbors, 2 women from her book club, a man who used to teach shop class, and a teenager named Liam who needed volunteer hours for school. The chapel began breathing again. By the 3rd week, we'd reinstalled the front door. Troy carved a new handle out of cedar. I stained it myself. As I wiped the cloth over the smooth grain, I thought about all the hands that would turn that knob one day, hesitant, hopeful, maybe even broken. This place would be for them, for anyone who had ever been told their prayers were inconvenient. Word spread slowly, then faster. Someone posted a photo on the town's Facebook group. "The old chapel lives." That's when Angela found out. It happened during dinner. Mark had grilled salmon. Angela was scooping quinoa onto the plates when she said, too casually, "Did you see this?" She turned her phone toward me. There it was, a photo of me in the chapel doorway, wind tugging at my dress, the headline above it reading, "Reviving Grace, Local Widow Restores Abandoned Church." I didn't answer. I simply reached for my fork. Mark looked at me then, not disapproving, just puzzled. "You've been restoring a church?" "I have." Angela let the silence stretch before adding, "We would have appreciated a heads up." I met her gaze. I built something loud enough for God to hear me. I didn't need permission. She looked down. Mark said nothing. The next morning, I opened the chapel alone. Emmett was late, and the volunteers wouldn't arrive for another hour. The air inside was still and clean. It smelled faintly of cedar and lemon oil from the polish I'd used on the pew ends. I walked to the back and unwrapped something I'd been carrying for weeks, a small framed plaque. I hung it on the wall near the door, just beneath the newly mounted cross. For the one who said I was too loud. Below it, in smaller print, may her name be remembered every time the choir sings. Angela didn't know yet. But she would. I didn't expect them to show up. That Sunday was meant to be soft. Just a small gathering for the volunteers, no announcements, no sermons, just candles, silence, and the breath of gratitude hanging in the air. I had spent the morning wiping down the backs of the newly restored pews, careful not to disturb the polished wood with too much oil. Clara and her friends had set up a simple table by the entrance with a thermos of hot cider and paper cups. Someone brought lemon pound cake. I brought my husband's hymnal. We weren't a congregation. Not really. Not yet. Just a handful of people who had found one another in the wreckage of something once forgotten, but we had returned it to form, if not to its full past, then to its present potential. At noon, we opened the doors. By 12:15, a dozen people had drifted in. By 12:30, I heard the crunch of familiar tires on gravel. I turned toward the open door. Mark stepped out first, dressed in khakis and a pressed button-up shirt I hadn't seen in years. Angela followed, holding the baby on her hip, her eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses despite the overcast sky. I watched them pause before crossing the threshold. Angela's gaze moved past me to the fresh wooden sign above the altar, Angela's Grace Chapel. She blinked once, jaw tightening, and stepped inside. Mark gave me a small nod. They sat near the back, not together. He sat 2 pews behind her, hands resting on his knees. She cradled the baby and didn't remove her sunglasses. I didn't greet them. I didn't make an announcement. I simply walked to the front, lit 1 candle, and opened my hymnal to a page marked with a torn piece of lace. We sang "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing," soft, off-key in parts, but with heart. Clara's voice cracked during the second verse. I kept my own steady, even when I saw Angela staring blankly at the stained glass of Mary. When the last note faded, I stepped forward and read aloud from Psalm 30. You turned my mourning into dancing. You removed my sackcloth and clothed me with joy. I didn't speak their names, but I didn't look away from them either. After the service, people lingered. Conversations floated. A child played with a pencil on the floor. Angela remained seated, pretending to look at the plaque near the door. Mark approached me slowly, hands in his pockets, gaze flickering across the chapel like he didn't know where to land. I didn't know it would be this peaceful, he said. It was built for that, I replied. He nodded once, looked down. You named it after her? I met his eyes, in honor of the silence she needed, and the voice I wouldn't give up. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The words never came, just a half exhale, half apology. I didn't press him. Angela finally stood, adjusted the baby's blanket, and walked past me without a word, but she paused at the plaque. She stared at it long enough that I thought she might say something. She didn't. Just nodded, the barest tilt of her chin, and stepped outside. That night, back at the house, the tension hovered like a ghost. I came in through the kitchen. Mark was at the sink, rinsing bottles. Angela was upstairs. The baby cried briefly, then went quiet again. Thanks for coming, I said softly. Mark kept his eyes on the soapy water. She wasn't ready for it. I didn't ask her to be. He glanced over his shoulder. I think that's what scared her. The next few days passed without major shifts. Angela remained civil. She didn't comment when she saw me polishing the cross I'd brought home for a final cleaning. She didn't ask where I kept going in the mornings. She just moved around me like a piece of furniture, acknowledged but unengaged. But I noticed small changes. She began playing softer music in the afternoons, instrumentals, a hymn once, barely audible under the hum of the baby monitor. She started setting out a 3rd plate at dinner, even if she didn't call me to the table. And one morning I found my rosary, previously tucked into the back of a drawer, gently placed beside my Bible on the nightstand. No note, no fanfare, just placed with care. At the chapel, work continued. We added fresh cushions to the pews. Clara organized a small weekly cleanup crew. Liam offered to create a website. We installed a donations box near the back. The first bill inside was a $10 note folded neatly with a sticky note wrapped around it. For my mother, who prayed even when we didn't listen. The handwriting looked like marks. That Sunday, Angela came again. Alone. No baby, no sunglasses. She sat in the third pew from the front, spine straight, hands folded tight in her lap. Her eyes were red, but she didn't cry. She just looked up at the stained glass and stayed through the entire service. Afterward, she approached me. "I was wrong," she said, barely above a whisper. "I didn't understand what prayer meant to you." "It's not about volume," I said gently. "It's about presence." She nodded slowly. "I know that now." We stood in silence for a long moment. Then she asked, "Can I light a candle?" I nodded. "Of course." She moved carefully to the altar, struck a match, and whispered something I couldn't hear, but I didn't need to. Her voice was her own now. And it didn't need to be loud to be real. "It's a peculiar thing, watching something you built shift into something others now claim as their own." The chapel had grown past me, not in distance, but in reach. What had started as a whispered intention now carried the weight of a dozen voices, then 2 dozen, then a slow stream of people I'd never met showing up with casseroles, candles, questions. They asked if I was the pastor. I told them no, just the caretaker. I wasn't called to preach, I was called to listen. And now, they came to be heard. Every Wednesday evening, we held what Clara named quiet hours. No readings, no music, just an open chapel, lit by soft lamps, and the occasional trembling votive. People came to sit in stillness, sometimes with grief, sometimes with silence they hadn't known they needed. I'd arrive early, light the central candle, and sit in the second pew. Not the first, that one I kept empty, in case someone needed to feel closer to something unseen. One night, a boy barely out of high school came in, hoodie pulled low, hands buried in his sleeves. He didn't speak, just sat on the far end, shoulders hunched. Half an hour passed before he stood, walked up to the altar, and left behind a key on the wooden rail. No note, no explanation. Later, I wrapped it in cloth and placed it in the drawer beneath the guest book. If someone needed it returned, they'd know where to ask. If not, it had served its purpose. People let go of different things in sacred spaces. Not everything has to be explained. Angela returned each Sunday. Never early, never late. She'd slip into the third pew, her pew now, and sit without fidgeting. Some weeks she'd light a candle, others, she'd simply bow her head. We didn't speak often, but we didn't need to. There's a kind of truce that doesn't require terms. Mark came with her once. He helped Liam replace a faulty bulb behind the altar, then stayed for a short service. Afterward, he hugged me, not one of those half-hearted pats, but a proper two-armed hold. It startled me more than anything he could have said. "I forgot how grounding it feels in here," he whispered. I didn't reply, just patted his back like I had when he was a boy with nightmares and a scraped knee. By mid-fall, the chapel needed painting. The outside still bore its weathered face, white chipping down to soft gray, like a woman showing her age without apology. We debated whether to keep the patina. Troy thought it gave character. Clara argued it looked neglected. I stood between them, amused. "Young buildings need to prove themselves," I said. "Old ones have already survived the weather." We settled on a compromise. Fresh paint for the trim, but leave the bones as they were. A little history never hurt anyone. One morning, I opened the mailbox at home and found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a note, written in a hand I didn't recognize. "I haven't stepped into a church in 10 years. I came on a dare, but something held me there. Thank you for making space." No name, no signature, just a small pressed violet enclosed inside. I tucked it into the hymnal I'd used that first Sunday. A page marked not by chapter or verse, but by something wordless and deeply human. Around Thanksgiving, we hosted a small meal in the chapel's side garden. Folding tables, plastic tablecloths, paper plates stacked beside ham and roasted squash. People brought what they could. Some brought nothing but company. That was enough. Angela helped arrange the serving line. At one point, I noticed her quietly guiding a young woman who was holding a baby no older than 3 months. The girl looked lost, her eyes flickering between the crowd and the child in her arms like she didn't know which one she belonged to. Angela knelt beside her, helped spoon mashed potatoes onto her plate, then offered her the empty seat beside her own. That's when I saw it. Not guilt, not obligation, but grace. Not mine, hers. The kind you grow into when you've seen both silence and mercy. That evening, I returned home exhausted, my feet ached, and my dress bore stains of cider and sweet potato. But my heart was full in a way I couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't known what it meant to be unwelcome in your own prayers. I slipped off my shoes and sat on the edge of the guest bed, the same room where I once clutched my Bible like a secret. Now, a candle flickered on the windowsill, lit by Angela before she'd left the house. No words, just light. Later that week, as I swept the chapel aisle before quiet hour, I found Angela's scarf draped over the third pew. I held it in my hands, its wool still carrying her warmth. I didn't fold it away. I left it there, just as it was. Sometimes, returning doesn't mean starting over, it means staying long enough for the silence to bloom. It was a Tuesday morning when the letter came. Heavy parchment, hand-addressed in fine cursive, sealed with a gold-embossed emblem I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was a late holiday card, someone from the chapel maybe, one of those polite gestures shared between near strangers during the colder months. But when I opened it and saw the letterhead, my breath caught in my chest. Charleston Heritage Foundation. They had heard about the chapel through a local feature that aired quietly on the evening news the week before. Clara's niece had arranged it without telling me, just a short spotlight piece, a feel-good segment sandwiched between weather updates and Christmas craft fairs. I'd smiled politely when I saw the crew arrive, camera in hand. I didn't expect anyone outside our zip code to notice. But someone had. The letter was an invitation, a nomination, to be exact. Angela's Grace Chapel had been shortlisted for a Community Preservation Award, one typically reserved for historic courthouses or long-standing landmarks. The foundation wanted to recognize ordinary restoration made sacred through community. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table, rereading the lines twice. Then a third time, I traced my finger along the name of the chapel, my daughter-in-law's name, born of quiet defiance and reshaped through unspoken reconciliation. It was surreal to see it printed in gold ink. Angela found the envelope later that day, sitting on the counter where I'd left it beside the tea canister. She held it for a moment, then looked at me, the corners of her mouth uncertain. "You're going to say yes, right?" I studied her face, not the polished calm she wore like armor in her early years with Mark, but something warmer now, more open. She hadn't returned to the third pew for several weeks, but I knew she still visited the chapel. I found her scarf there often, always moved slightly from its last resting place. "I don't know," I said. "Why not?" I looked out the window toward the small backyard, now bare and brittle from winter's breath. "Because I didn't build it to be seen." Angela sat down across from me. The baby's soft coos came through the monitor beside her. "But people see it now, and maybe they see you too." That sentence rested heavy between us. She didn't mean it as a compliment or a challenge, just truth. And truth, spoken plainly, is often the most uncomfortable gift. That night, I sat at the altar alone, the chapel door unlocked but undisturbed. The lights were dim, the quiet pressing. I lit a single candle and stared at the cross above the plaque. So much had changed. What began as retreat had become refuge. What once felt like a correction had become. And yet, part of me still hesitated. Recognition didn't always sit easily on old shoulders. I'd spent so much of my life making room for others, space for their ambitions, their noise, their grief, that taking up space of my own felt strange, almost indulgent. But then I thought about the boy who left his key, the woman who cried beside the merry window, the toddler who toddled between pews with crackers in her hand, whispering shoo to herself like she'd inherited reverence. This wasn't about being seen, it was about what had been witnessed here. The decision made itself. A week later, I stood beside Clara in the town hall's event room, dressed in the same light blue dress I'd worn that first Sunday. She insisted on pinning a flower corsage to my left shoulder. Troy polished the plaque before we left. Angela helped me curl the edges of my hair. Mark drove us. The award was simple, etched glass, heavy in the hand. But the applause when they called the chapel's name was honest, not thunderous, but heartfelt. I accepted it quietly, then turned to the crowd and said just one thing. This place wasn't born from power or wealth. It was born from the moment someone told me to be quiet, and I decided not to. The room went still. Then slowly, someone clapped. And then everyone did. Back at home, I placed the award on the narrow shelf above the chapel's door. Not where the eye lands first, but where the light caught it just enough to remind us it was there. Angela joined me in the doorway. "You said yes," she whispered. "I did. Thank you For building something when I tried to shrink you. I looked at her, not with triumph, not with resentment, just a soft ache that had finally found rest. I didn't build it against you, Angela. I built it because I needed to remember who I was. She nodded slowly, eyes shining. And you helped me remember who I want to be. That night, the third pew was full again. Angela sat with the baby in her arms, rocking gently. And I, in the second pew, closed my eyes and prayed, not loudly, not defiantly, but freely. No one asked me to be quiet. No one needed to. The morning after the award ceremony, the house felt quieter than it had in months. Not because the silence was empty, it was full, weighted with something I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Respect. But respect, I soon remembered, doesn't always arrive in the rooms where you expect it. I sat by the window in the kitchen, the light catching the delicate folds of my light blue dress as I poured myself a cup of tea. Pearl earrings glinted softly, the subtle reminder of the woman I'd become, standing firm through storms and silences. Mark appeared in the doorway, brushing a hand through his hair, eyes shifting as if he weren't sure whether to approach or retreat. "Mom," he said hesitantly, "I wanted to talk about the chapel." I set the cup down carefully, meeting his gaze. "Go on," I said. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Angela's worried it's taking too much of your time. She thinks maybe you're distancing yourself." I felt the faintest flicker of old frustration, but held it back. This wasn't about me. It was about what they feared, losing the version of me they had tried to silence. "I'm not distancing," I said quietly. "I'm reclaiming." He nodded, as if that were something he needed to hear but couldn't fully understand. Later, Angela came down the stairs, the baby nestled in a sling against her chest. She moved slowly, her eyes avoiding mine at first, but then settling with a quiet determination I hadn't seen before. "I wanted to apologize," she said simply, "for the way I treated you, for not understanding." I reached out to touch her hand, the familiar softness grounding me. "It's hard to hold space for someone else's faith when you feel like your own is being crowded out," I replied. She squeezed my fingers and whispered, "Thank you for making room." The days that followed were different. Conversations flowed easier. There were no longer pauses thick enough to choke on. Dinner became a table where voices shared stories rather than silence. Angela brought photos from her childhood to show me. I told tales from my youth that made Mark laugh over breakfast. One afternoon, I found a letter taped to the front door. It was from the city council, permission granted for the chapel to host small community events. A validation, official and unexpected. I placed it on the mantel, a silent testament to all that had been built not just with wood and nails, but with hope and resilience. That Sunday, the chapel was full. Not just with familiar faces, but with neighbors I'd never met, families drawn by the warmth that now radiated from its walls. The light poured through the stained glass, painting the floor in colors that danced like fireflies. I stood at the front, the scent of polished wood and candle wax mingling in the air, and sang. My voice was neither loud nor soft, just true. After the service, Mark and Angela approached me, the baby asleep in her mother's arms. "We want to help," Angela said. Her eyes shone with sincerity. "I think the chapel needs more than repairs," Mark added. "It needs people who believe in what it can become." I smiled, tears pricking the corners of my eyes. The chapel was no longer just mine. It belonged to all of us now. That night, as I sat by the window watching the stars, I thought of my husband, of the day he asked me to marry him beneath a sky so wide it held all our dreams. I whispered a prayer, not loud, not quiet, but full of gratitude, for the space reclaimed, for the voices heard, and for the faith that would never be silenced again. Winter had come quietly that year, wrapping the town in soft blankets of snow that muffled the usual sounds of daily life. The chapel looked different under its white coat, more peaceful somehow, like it was holding its breath in reverence of the season. I was there early, one frosty morning, brushing snow from the wooden steps before the sun had fully risen. My breath rose in soft clouds as I worked, and the chill bit at my fingertips despite my gloves, the faint smell of pine from the nearby forest mixed with the distant smoke of chimneys. I loved mornings like this, still, untouched, full of possibility. Inside, the chapel was warm. The old heater rattled softly in the corner, pushing out heat like a stubborn old friend. I pulled my light blue dress tighter around me and settled into the wooden pew near the front. The scent of polished wood mingled with the faint aroma of pine from the garlands Clara and the volunteers had strung along the beams. On the small table beside me rested a basket filled with freshly baked bread and honey jars from a neighbor who had taken to calling the chapel her second home. I closed my eyes and listened. The chapel was no longer just a building to me, it was a refuge for the voices that once felt unheard, the voices of the lost, the weary, the misunderstood. On this particular morning, my thoughts wandered to the journey that had brought me here, from the coldness of a house where my prayers were once called too loud, to the warmth of this growing sanctuary that embraced every whispered hope. I smiled to myself, thinking about Angela and Mark, and how our paths had slowly begun to intertwine again, fragile but real. The door creaked open softly and Clara entered, carrying a tray of steaming coffee. She placed it on the small table and sat beside me, her smile gentle and knowing. "Cold enough for you?" she asked, wrapping her hands around a cup. "Cold, but hopeful," I answered. We sat quietly for a few moments, the silence between us comfortable. "You know," Clara said, "when this all started, I wasn't sure it would last, but now it feels like the heart of the town." I nodded. "It's more than just the building, it's the people." She smiled and added, "And the prayers that fill it." Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped low, I found myself back home, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. The house felt different now, warmer, somehow, even though the rooms were still the same. Angela was there, sitting at the kitchen table with Mark and the baby. They greeted me with quiet smiles. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like an outsider in my own home. After dinner, Angela approached me, baby cradled in her arms. "I wanted to thank you," she said softly, "for building the chapel, for not giving up." I reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. "It was never about me," I replied. "It was about making space, for you, for Mark, for all of us." She nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. The weeks passed, and the chapel grew busier. Quiet hours expanded to include a weekly gathering for those seeking solace. Clara organized a monthly potluck, and soon the chapel became a place where stories were shared alongside prayers. One cold evening, I found myself sitting alone in the chapel, the only light coming from the flickering candles. I opened my Bible and read softly. The words brought comfort, but also a new realization. This was no longer just my journey, it was ours. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered ground. The footprints leading to the chapel were fresh, a sign that the place was alive with new footsteps, new stories. As I looked up at the cross above the door, I whispered a prayer of gratitude for the journey, for the healing, for the voices that had finally found their home. Spring arrived gradually, the first tentative shoots breaking through the stubborn earth around the chapel. I found myself spending more mornings in the garden than inside, planting bulbs Clara had brought over, tracing the outlines of flower beds I dreamed of filling with color by summer. The chapel was no longer just a refuge for voices, it was becoming a sanctuary for growth, both for the people who gathered there and for the land itself. On one such morning, as the sun warmed my shoulders through the light blue dress I wore like armor, I noticed a young woman standing at the gate. She looked hesitant, clutching a small notebook to her chest, as if it were a shield. I smiled gently and stepped forward, greeting her with the same warmth I wished I had been shown all those years ago. "Welcome," I said softly. She returned the smile, the tension in her shoulders easing. "I've heard about this place, about what you've done. I was hoping I could come in." I nodded. "You're welcome any time." Her name was Evelyn, and she told me she had been searching for a place to find peace, something she hadn't felt in years. As we talked, I realized that the chapel was no longer just mine, no longer just Angela's grace. It belonged to every broken and hopeful heart that found its way through these doors. That afternoon, Mark and Angela visited the chapel with the baby, bringing with them a picnic basket filled with sandwiches and homemade cookies. We ate outside, beneath a blooming cherry tree whose petals floated lazily in the breeze like whispered blessings. Angela watched as the baby's tiny fingers reached out toward the blossoms, and for a moment, the weight of old wounds seemed to lift between us. "I never thought I'd see this place full of life again," Mark said, his voice tinged with wonder. I smiled and replied, "Neither did I, but faith has a way of growing where it's nurtured." The garden became our collective project. Volunteers arrived on weekends to weed and water, to plant seeds and dreams alike. Clara organized craft workshops for children, turning the chapel into a place where creativity blossomed alongside spirituality. One afternoon, as I knelt among the tulips, a teenager named Liam approached, holding a sketchbook filled with drawings of the chapel and its surroundings. "I'm trying to capture its spirit," he said shyly. I looked at his sketches, each line delicate, each shadow purposeful. "You're doing more than that," I told him. "You're giving it life." With summer approaching, the chapel planned its first outdoor concert, a celebration of community and renewal. Musicians rehearsed beneath the old oak tree, their melodies weaving through the air like threads of hope. I watched from the porch, the baby asleep in Angela's arms, and felt a profound sense of peace. The journey from exclusion to belonging had been long and winding, but here, in this moment, it felt like a new chapter had begun. That night, as I sat in the quiet of the chapel, I reflected on all that had changed. The chapel was no longer a symbol of defiance, but of reconciliation. The voices once silenced now sang together in harmony. I closed my eyes and whispered a prayer, not for myself, but for everyone who would ever need a place to be heard. And as the candle flickered softly beside me, I knew that faith, when loud or quiet, was never meant to be confined. It was the evening of the concert, a gentle buzz of anticipation floating through the air like the sweet scent of honeysuckle that had begun to creep along the chapel walls. Families, friends, and strangers alike gathered in the courtyard, folding chairs set in neat rows, string lights draped between the oak trees twinkling as the sun began to dip beyond the horizon. I stood near the entrance, dressed in my familiar light blue church dress, the pearl earrings catching the soft glow of lanterns. My hands were clasped loosely in front of me, the familiar tremor of age steadied by the calm that had settled deep into my bones these past months. The chapel behind me hummed quietly, a beacon not just of brick and timber, but of hope and healing. The murmurs of the crowd stirred memories of how far this place had come, from a whispered defiance to a communal heartbeat. Angela approached with the baby, the soft cooing mingling with the laughter and chatter around us. She looked radiant, her features softened by the fading light and the unguarded smile she reserved for moments when she felt truly at peace. "Tonight feels different," she said quietly, leaning toward me so the baby wouldn't hear. "It does," I replied, "like a promise." We shared a glance, a tacit acknowledgement of all the unspoken journeys we had both taken to arrive at this moment. Mark joined us then, holding a guitar case, the weight of responsibility evident in the line of his shoulders, but lifted slightly by the anticipation in his eyes. The music began softly, a string quartet playing a melody that seemed to echo through the trees and into the souls of those gathered. I found a seat near the front, the gentle rhythm guiding my breath into a steady cadence. I watched as the crowd swayed, some closing their eyes, others nodding along with quiet smiles. Children passed around homemade lanterns, their soft flames flickering like tiny stars. I felt the warmth of community enfolding me, a tapestry woven with threads of resilience and grace. During an intermission, I wandered outside to the garden, the cool night air filled with the mingled scents of earth and flowers. The stars were just beginning to punctuate the dark velvet sky, and a solitary firefly hovered near a blooming rose. Clara joined me, her voice low. "You've given this town something precious, more than a chapel, a sanctuary for the soul." I nodded, the weight of her words settling like a benediction. "It wasn't always easy," I admitted. "There were days when silence felt like the only option." "Sometimes," she said softly, "silence is the beginning of a new voice." Returning inside, I took my seat as Mark stepped forward to sing a hymn, his voice steady, carrying the melodies of our shared past and hopes for the future. Angela watched him, eyes glistening, the baby nestled peacefully against her chest. I saw the pride in her expression, the quiet respect born of understanding. When the music faded and the crowd began to disperse, people approached me, old friends and new, offering words of thanks and stories of how the chapel had touched their lives. Each word was a brick laid upon the foundation of this place, each story a thread strengthening the fabric of community. Later, as the last guests said their goodbyes and the courtyard emptied, I stood once more at the chapel's entrance. The lanterns were dimmed, the string lights glowing faintly like distant stars. I took a deep breath, the crisp night air filling my lungs, and whispered a prayer of gratitude, not just for the chapel or its journey, but for the voices once silenced and now singing. For Angela, for Mark, for the baby asleep in her arms. For myself. For all of us. The days lengthened, with the coming of summer, each sunrise bringing a fresh chorus of birdsong and the gentle hum of life stirring in and around the chapel. The place, once quiet and tentative, now thrived with an energy I hadn't dared to hope for when I first crossed its threshold. That morning, as light spilled warmly across the worn wooden pews, I sat quietly near the altar, hands resting on the well-loved Bible, its edges softened by years of devotion. The air smelled faintly of wild flowers and fresh wood, a subtle reminder of the gardens blossoming outside. Today was special. It marked 1 year since I began restoring this chapel, a full cycle of seasons that had reshaped not just the building but the community within its walls and within my heart. Early in the day, Clara arrived with a basket of freshly baked bread and a bouquet of lavender she'd picked herself. She smiled broadly, eyes bright with excitement. "The youth group is coming this afternoon," she said. "They want to learn about the chapel's history and maybe help plant more flowers." I nodded, pleased. The idea of young hands nurturing this place felt like the most beautiful kind of inheritance. As we prepared, I thought of all the ways this chapel had grown beyond me, through the small acts of kindness, the shared prayers, and the growing trust between generations. Angela appeared soon after, carrying the baby wrapped in a soft cotton blanket. She paused near the entrance, watching the sunbeam dance along the aisle. "I wanted to bring Ava by," she said softly, "to meet the place that's been such a part of our lives." I gestured to a small rocking chair near the window, its cushions embroidered with delicate floral patterns. "She'll love the light here," I told her. Angela smiled, her expression tender and full of gratitude. The youth group arrived in a lively cluster, teenagers chatting, some shy, others confident, led by their pastor, a young woman whose enthusiasm mirrored Clara's own. They gathered around me as I told the story of the chapel, how it had been abandoned, then brought back from silence, built brick by brick, prayer by prayer, with a quiet defiance against being silenced. The teenagers listened intently, eyes wide with curiosity and wonder. One boy, no older than 15, raised his hand. "Did you ever feel like giving up?" I smiled gently, my fingers tracing the worn edges of the altar. "More times than I can count, but faith is not about never falling, it's about finding the strength to rise each time." Later, as the sun dipped low, the group gathered in the garden to plant new flowers, sunflowers, daisies, marigolds, hands dug into the rich soil, laughter spilling into the air. I knelt among them, guiding small hands to carefully place seeds, feeling the warmth of connection in the shared labor. The baby crawled near, reaching out to touch the petals, her giggles ringing like a bell of pure joy. Mark watched from the porch, leaning against the frame with a soft smile. Angela sat beside him, resting her head against his shoulder. After the planting, I took a moment alone by the old oak tree that stood sentinel at the chapel's edge. Its sturdy branches stretched wide, a silent witness to all that had passed beneath. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply, the scent of earth and flowers filling me with peace. Memories came unbidden of my husband, of the first days in the silent house where prayers felt too loud, of the gentle rebirth of this sacred space. And I realized that the chapel was not just a building or a refuge. It was a living testament to the power of perseverance, love, and grace. That night, as twilight deepened and stars began to twinkle overhead, the chapel doors remained open, a beacon in the dark. Inside, I lit the central candle, its flame steady and warm. I knelt in the quiet, whispering a prayer not only for those who had found this place, but for all who still searched for a space to be seen, heard, and loved. And as the candle flickered softly, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey, for the healing, and for the unwavering faith that had led me here. The seasons turned again, as they always do, and with them came a quiet shift that I felt more than saw. It was the subtle kind of change that settles in your bones, soft, sure, and unyielding. Summer's warmth faded into the crisp edges of early autumn, painting the trees in fiery reds and golds. The chapel's garden, once bursting with vibrant blooms, began to prepare for its winter rest. The community that had gathered here throughout the year now found new rhythms, but the chapel stood as a constant, steady, and welcoming. One evening, as the sun lowered itself beyond the horizon, I sat alone in the chapel's nave. The wooden pew beneath my hands felt smooth and familiar, worn by countless prayers and whispered hopes. The stained glass above filtered the fading light, casting kaleidoscopic patterns across the floor and walls. I was lost in thought, my fingers tracing the edges of the worn Bible resting on my lap, when the chapel doors creaked open. Angela entered quietly, the baby cradled against her chest, her steps measured and soft. She moved down the aisle, her eyes scanning the room before settling on me. There was a hesitation in her gaze, an unspoken question. I smiled gently, inviting her to join me. She hesitated a moment longer, then sat beside me. For a while, we simply shared the silence, two women connected by history, by pain, and by the unexpected grace of this reclaimed place. Finally, she spoke. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice low and careful, "about how much this chapel means, not just to you, but to all of us." I nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle between us like a warm blanket. "I want to help," she continued, "not just with the baby or the garden, but with the future of this place." Her words surprised me, not because I doubted her sincerity, but because the woman who once told me my prayers were too loud had grown into someone who understood the power of a voice raised in hope. We talked long into the evening, plans unfolding like petals. Together, we sketched ideas for new programs, youth gatherings, meditation circles, community meals. We discussed how to make the chapel a place not only for worship, but for healing, for learning, for belonging. Mark joined us late, his presence grounding the conversation with a quiet strength I'd seen blossom in him over the past year. The next morning, I woke early, the sun casting long shadows across the floor. I dressed carefully in my light blue church dress, the fabric soft against my skin, and pinned my pearl earrings. They felt like armor, reminders of who I was and all I had endured. At the chapel, volunteers bustled about, preparing for the first of the new programs we had planned. A weekly storytelling circle where anyone could share their journey, their struggles, their dreams. As people gathered, the room filled with the hum of voices and the scent of fresh coffee and cinnamon. I sat near the front, watching as a young woman stood to speak, her voice shaky at first, then steadying as she found strength in the shared space. Later, Clara approached me, eyes sparkling. "You've created more than a chapel," she said. "You've created a home." I smiled, feeling the truth of her words echo in my heart. Days passed in a blur of activity and quiet moments. The chapel continued to grow, not just as a building, but as a sanctuary for the weary and the hopeful. One afternoon, as I tended to the garden, I noticed the baby crawling towards me, her tiny fingers reaching for the wildflowers. Angela watched nearby, her smile soft and unguarded. In that moment, surrounded by the life we had nurtured, I understood that this chapel was no longer just a symbol of my journey, but a living testament to the power of resilience, forgiveness, and love. That evening, as dusk settled, I lit a candle and knelt in prayer. I prayed for the voices that still struggled to be heard, for the hands that built and nurtured, for the hearts that found shelter here. And I thanked the quiet strength that had carried me through the years, transforming pain into purpose. The morning was quiet, the kind of gentle calm that felt like a breath held before a smile. I sat by the window of the chapel's little study, a room once dusty and forgotten, but now filled with the soft scent of fresh paper and wild flowers in a vase. The sunlight filtered through the stained glass, painting the wooden floor with shards of color, deep reds, blues, and golds that shimmered like a promise. I held an old journal in my lap, its leather cover cracked and worn, pages filled with inked prayers, sketches of the chapel's renovations, and snippets of letters from friends and strangers alike. Each entry was a step in a journey I had never imagined I'd walk. And yet, here I was, still walking, still hoping. Today, a group from the nearby senior center was visiting. They wanted to see the chapel, hear its story, and perhaps find a little piece of their own within these walls. I heard the murmur of voices in the courtyard, soft laughter drifting through the open door. The sound reminded me of Sundays past, the days when Mark was small and his laughter had filled every corner of our home. Nostalgia wrapped around me, but it didn't sting, it soothed. Clara appeared first, her smile radiant as always, leading a small group of elders with canes and cardigans, their faces bright with curiosity and kindness. They moved slowly but eagerly, eyes wide as they took in the restored woodwork, the vibrant garden glimpsed through the windows, and the cross that stood proudly behind the altar. I greeted them warmly, feeling a quiet joy settle in my chest. Sharing this place with others, people who understood what it meant to hold memories close, was a gift I hadn't known I needed. As the tour unfolded, one woman, her hair silver and soft like mine, lingered by a stained glass window. She traced her finger gently over the colorful glass. "This reminds me of my mother's church," she said softly. "It's like coming home." I nodded, understanding that the chapel had become more than just a building. It was a vessel for belonging, a sanctuary where past and present met. Later, as we gathered in the chapel for a brief reflection, the room filled with stories, some joyful, some tinged with loss, but all spoken with a tenderness that echoed the chapel's spirit. After the visitors left, I remained seated near the altar, my hands folded in quiet contemplation. The chapel was still and warm, the faint scent of lavender wafting from the open windows. Angela appeared, stepping lightly through the doorway. She carried the baby, who had finally settled into a peaceful sleep. She approached me slowly, eyes bright but serene. "I wanted to thank you," she said simply, "for this place, for everything you've done. It's changed us." I smiled, reaching out to gently touch her hand. "It's changed me too," I replied, "more than I can say." That evening, Mark came by, his footsteps light on the worn floorboards. He sat beside me on a pew, the quiet between us comfortable. "You did something remarkable," he said, voice low. "You took what was meant to silence you and made it into a song." I looked at him, pride and love filling my heart. "And you?" I asked gently, "what song will you sing?" He smiled, thoughtful. "I think I'm still learning the notes." As night settled over the chapel and the world beyond grew dark, I knelt by the altar, the candlelight flickering softly. The flame cast gentle shadows, dancing like the memories and hopes that filled this sacred space. I whispered a prayer, not for myself but for the voices that had been quieted, the prayers that had been too loud, and the spaces where all could be heard. And as the candle burned steady, I felt the chapel's heartbeat sync with my own, steady, enduring, and full of grace.